Alright, so I am Kira Ransom for Professor Maniates' Intro to World War II class, and I chose the topic Ghost Riders, which is when the American soldiers and the German soldiers came together to work to save horses during the last days of World War II. So before we begin, these are some of the topics we're going to be covering. The Lipizaners, which were the horses that the Germans, and the Americans were working to save. And let's get into it. First, we have some definitions and abbreviations. So GIs, which was a term that most people have probably heard of from G.I. Joe, was a slang for American soldiers during this time. The CSDIC was the British Army's Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. Captain Spurl will be mentioned later. He was trained here. The IPW is the Interrogation Prisoner of War. POW is a pretty common one. That means Prisoner of War. Kraut, this was a derogatory slang word for Germans during this time. The SS was the German army, and it stood for Schutzstaffel. And then finally, the Luftwaffe was the Nazi Air Force during this time. So before we begin getting into the horses, just a brief history of the Second World War. And by September 10th, 1944, the world was deep in a global war. 5 years since Germany had invaded Poland, setting off a war that would lead to the highest amount of death ever recorded in a war, over 75 million. And by the latter half of this year, Germany was losing traction. The Americans' attack on Normandy Beach for D-Day, their forces had stretched the German forces really wide, really thin, and they were starting to sink in the ocean of war. And the Allied forces, determined to bring Germany to her knees, sent relentless air raids through Germany and her territories, and notably here for this project was in Austria. And on September 10th, 1944, the Spanish riding school was bombed, which is what started this whole chain of events. So, what are Lipizaners? They are often referred to as white gold, and they are actually a breed of horse. And they originated in Spain and bred from the ancient Andalusians. They are the only horses capable of performing this special type of dressage that's called the airs above the ground. And only the stallions can do it. And the stallions are trained for years alongside their riders to learn these moves and forms. And where they are trained is the Spanish riding school, and it is housed in the Hofburg Palace in Austria, constructed in 1565, and ran by Alois Podowski at the time of World War II. It excels in teaching Lipizaner stallions the arts of haute école, or high school. And this area had managed to avoid the war for the most part until late 1944, which is when it was bombed by B-17s and B-24s. And the Winter Riding School, also mentioned, is also located at Hofburg Palace in the St. Michael Wing. And this is where the Lipizaners perform, where the Spanish riding school is where they're trained. And so they perform here, and it's also where royal balls and festivities have been held for centuries. Construction began in 1729 under the orders of Emperor Charles VI and finished in 1735. And according to the inscription on the riding school arch, the school was built for the instruction and training of the young nobility and for the training of horses for dressage and for war. And this area was also struck by the bombings on September 10th. As mentioned before, September 10th is when the Americans struck the Spanish and winter riding schools, and as soon as the air raid sirens started, The grooms and the riders and the horses all jumped into action. The horses had to be taken from the school and across a courtyard into a sheltered hallway so that they would not be harmed by the bombs. And after this bombing, Podolsky knew that the horses could not stay here any longer. He knew that if the stallions were to stay, they were going to be in grave danger of being wiped out completely. And this was Podolsky's plan. He knew he needed to move his stallions outside of the bombers' raids in order to ensure the survival of the breed past the Second World War. And in December of 1944, Podolsky was thrown a lifeline by Count von Arco off Valley. He located in St. Martin in Upper Austria. And he inspected the stables and he approved. But unfortunately for him, he did not have the authority to actually move the horses out of this area. So he had to go to a higher power. And since he wasn't able to do this quite yet, he needed to move them under diversions. And through clever ruses, Podolsky managed to move out 45 of the 60 Lipizzaner stallions by February of 1945, and following another devastating air raid, the High Command caved and gave evacuation orders to move the stallions from the riding school. However, the command had been given, but he still needed specific permission from the top Nazi in Vienna, which was Baldur von Schirach. And he was descended from a noble German family. He was actually born an American citizen, though, but he married the daughter of Heinrich Hoffmann, who was Hitler's personal photographer, and he served as the Hitler Youth leader before traveling to France to serve as a junior army officer. In 1940, Hitler sent him to Vienna to be the Gau leader there, and he faithfully carried out Hitler's policies, including deporting 65,000 Vietnamese Jews to concentration camps. And this is who Podolsky needed to convince to move the remaining stallions. And despite the von Schirach's acts in the war, he did love the horses, but he also did not necessarily want to move the horses out of Vienna because his belief was that if they moved the horses, they would be taking away the hope that still remained in Vienna and also admitting total defeat to the Allied powers. But after the meeting with Podolsky, he changed his mind and he said although he loved the stallions and loved having them there, he loved them too much to leave them in danger any longer. And he told him to go to Upper Austria. So the next steps. The stallions were now safe from the American bombers, but stallions obviously aren't the only component to continuing a breed, which means they also needed mares, and in this case, all the mares were housed at Hostau, which was a breeding stables that hoped to create the greatest war horse the world had ever seen under the orders of Gustav Rau. And Rau was a horse breeder. He was determined that European horses were superior, much as the Nazis believed the Aryan race was superior. And his theory was that if Britain could have the best thoroughbreds, Poland the greatest the greatest racehorses, then Germany would have the best war horses. Which is why all the mares were sent here. And unfortunately, where Hostau was, Russia was drawing closer to them, and the fear rose among the stables. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Rudolfsky of the Nazi Air Force. Nope, sorry, wrong person. Rudolfsky was the commanding officer at the stud farm, and he followed Rau's orders to achieve the Aryan racehorse. And even though life was pretty peaceful at Hostau, it was an illusion. The war was raging right outside their walls, and if the Soviets invaded, the largest likelihood was that they would kill everyone in the town, in the stud, and they would also slaughter the horses to be used as food. So the Cossacks had been invaded by Stalin before World War II, and they held no allegiance to Moscow or the Red Army because of this. So, because of that, thousands of Terek, Don, and Cuban Cossacks had backed Hitler and his Nazis, hoping that they would gain independence from the Russians from this. But by March 1945, they figured out that they had been backing the wrong side, and they figured that the only way to get out of this was to surrender to the Western Allies, because they knew if the Red Army caught them, they would be executed as traitors to the Soviets. So the Cossacks had fought hard and long for the Nazis, and they decided that it was time for the Germans to repay these services, which meant that they came to Hostau and forced Rudovsky to give them shelter for both them and their horses. And so at this point, the Stad now held over 600 horses, which is over 3 times what it was built to hold. And so this is the Air Force General. The colonel, or Oberst, in the Nazi Air Force, Holters arrived in late April at the Hostau stud farm and listened to Rudovsky as he gave him a presentation of a Grey Arabian named Lotnik. And Holters was fond of horses, and this presentation gave him the strength to tell Rudovsky what he had come to announce. Vienna had fallen to the Russians, and they were on their way. Holters urged Rudovsky, for the sake of the prized horses, to contact the Americans and plead their case so that they might be saved. Holters told him about Germany's most prized racehorse, Alchemist, and he had been captured by the Russians, and when he refused to load onto their trucks, they shot him. And several of the other horses were slaughtered and eaten by the army. And even after hearing this, Rudovsky still hesitated about moving the horses out, and so Holters took action, which led him to Colonel Hank Reed of the American 2nd Cavalry Group, and he was the commanding officer at the closest American encampment to Hostau. On April 25th, he learned of a German Air Force unit that had been stranded in a small town called Dianahof, in a small hunting cabin surrounded by thick woods. The 12th Corps headquarters had sent Reed an order to seize this lodge and the records and files that they believed to be in there. And so Reed called in Captain Ferdinand Spurl, who was, as mentioned earlier, trained in the intelligence branch. And he ordered Spurl to make a plan and be ready to move out the next morning to seize that material for the Corps headquarters. But as he got ready to roll out the next morning, a Nazi officer arrived from there with white flags. So Operation Sauerkraut was a nickname by Reed for this operation to seize the material, but it was put on pause when Colonel Holters rolled up to the American encampment on April 26th, and Spurl, who had just about been ready to leave for Dianahof, was surprised to find that the enemy had showed up peacefully on his doorstep. And so the German repeatedly demanded to speak to a senior officer. Reed ordered him through to his HQ, and Spurl brought him to the IPW camp, or tent, which was mentioned earlier, to interrogate him and get necessary information. And Holters was reluctant at first to give Spurl anything but part of his name, which was Walter H. And Spurl demanded he turned out his pockets, and when he did, he revealed a leather wallet that had interesting pictures in it, and these pictures ended up being horses. And so when Spurl, he questioned the German on the significance of the photos, and Holters just shrugged. He didn't want to tell him anything about them. And so, let me find my spot. And he realized, after pressing Holters for a while, he finally got information about the Lipizaners, which were the horses in the photos. And he realized that not only did they have a Luftwaffe officer in their base, but one from the exact base that he'd been planning to infiltrate that morning. And so Spurl brought the pictures to Reed and told him about the Lipizaners, and Reed agreed to hear the story behind them, and so finally Holters was able to meet with him personally. And so, with this discussion, after talking about the Lipizaners with Reed, the colonel just dropped all pretense and told the Americans his full name, along with the fact that he was a commanding officer at Die Stelle Ost, which was a secret Luftwaffe intelligence unit. And Reed talked with him, telling him that the Americans may, in fact, be able to aid Germany on this, which is why Holters had come. And there were terms that had to be followed, though. And so Reed agreed that the Americans could possibly aid the Germans and save the horses from the Russians, but he told them that they needed all of the information from Diana Hoff, and they also needed the cooperation of the Germans there. And if this could be done peacefully, then the Germans would be transported to the European Theater Operations HQ for interrogation, only on the Soviet army, not on the German army, so they would not be committing treason. And Reed told Holters that if all this took place, that he would do his best to save the horses at Hostau. But, as always, a problem arises. And so, Holters, along with Spurl and a few other American soldiers, came through the dense woods to Diana Hof to explain these terms and conditions to the other Germans there. And the problem that arose was that they could not simply hand over all of the information, because if they were caught, it would be a death sentence from the Nazi army, because it would be seen as this huge act of treason. And they had taken an oath to Hitler, which meant they couldn't just give the Americans the information. But after lots of discussion, a new plan was formed, and the Americans would stage a false attack on Diana Hof, and after gunfire had been traded, then the Germans would surrender all of the information to the Americans and keep up their end of the deal. And so, with the new plan in mind, Diana Hof was attacked by the Americans with 2 M24 Chaffee tanks and 2 armored M8 cars, jeeps, and trucks. And they came through the woods to the hunting cabin, and both sides traded fire to make the conflict look real. And once they were there, Luftwaffes and GIs worked side by side to move all of the crates of records and documents into the American trucks. And once they had everything in the trucks and everyone was clear of the building, an American Chaffee tank opened fire on the building and pretty much destroyed the building. And after they had been done with that, a German Greyhound tank also fired to give the impression of exchanging gunfire, so that anyone listening would believe that a real fight had occurred here. And so, after this had all been done, even though Reed had so far negotiated this deal, the ultimate authority to forge ahead to Hostau laid in the hands of 3rd Army Commander General George S. Patton. Lucky for Reed, though, Patton thrived. He lived for war, and as far as he was concerned, this war was over. And he wasn't quite ready for that. So when presented an opportunity for one last hurrah to take place, he took it. And he sent this message to Reed, stating, "Get them, make it fast. You will have new mission." The words "you will have new mission" implied that this window of opportunity would be extremely short. And the message was also not a direct order. Patton would not put it in writing that he had ordered Reed to go save the horses, so if it went great, then that was good, and if it went poorly, then Patton would not be blamed for this. But Reed, he knew that his reputation was not nearly as important as saving these horses, so he had Holters draft a letter to send Rudofsky at the stud, requesting for one of his officers to come to the encampment to discuss the new plan taking place. And Rudofsky, there was quite a bit of back and forth on whether to trust this letter from who claimed to be the Colonel Holters. He decided to send one of his two head veterinarians at the stud, which was Rudolph Lessing. And he followed a map through the woods, carrying a white flag. And when he reached the American encampment, the Reed explained that the other Germans had been taken back behind American lines for investigations, but that Reed, he agreed that the horses needed to be saved. But he also told Lessings that the Germans at Hostau would have to give their full and complete cooperation for the Americans to step in. And, as always, we have a new problem, which was, at this time of year, it was foaling season, which means that the mares could not be moved, the foals could not be moved of their own volition, because a lot of them would end up injured or dead. So Lessing suggested to Reed that the Americans occupy Hostau instead of transferring the horses to American lines. And Reed did not agree to this yet, but he did agree to send one of his officers to Hostau to inspect and negotiate with Rudofsky. And he decided to send Captain Thomas M. Stewart, who is pictured here. And he was the 42nd Cavalry Squadron's military intelligence officer. And much like Patton with Reed, he did not order Stewart to go there because he knew it was dangerous. But Stewart took the mission, and he started towards Hostau that same night, using Lessing as his guide to get there. And at 2 a.m., April 27th, they arrived at the stud. I'm going to grab a drink real quick. So, we have another roadblock! Yay! And this one was Lessings went to Rudofsky explaining the situation, and the stud commander grew irritated because he did not have the authority to allow the Americans to come in, and it would have to be taken up with General Schultz. And the general, predictably, did not take kindly to this information and exploded towards Lessing, calling him a traitor, telling him he would be killed for this act of treason. And Lessing yelled back. He told him that winning the war was no longer an option, the Nazis had officially lost, and that saving the horses was still possible, even if winning the war wasn't. And Schultz agreed that, hey, maybe this guy is right, but he also could not make this a decision. And so that means he had to bring it before the Corps commander, which means he had to go to Schloss Jabacht, which was another roadblock because Reed had given Stewart 24-hour period, and that would have violated it. So the other vet, Kroll, he rode to the American lines, explained the situation, and when that had been complete, Lessing mounted up for the ride to the commander. And he basically had the same exact conversation that he had had with Schultz about the Nazis already losing the war and the horses needing to be saved. And the commander told him that he wouldn't argue against it, but he also wouldn't give them written permission. But as Lessings was leaving the castle, one of the helpers, the secretaries, caught up with him and gave him written permission that the Corps commander had decided to give him, which meant the operation was officially a go. And so the mission was going to be very short-handed, and Reed resolved to send 3 separate forces to secure Hostile, which were Troops A, C, and E, along with 5 tanks and 2 motor carriages from Company F. The biggest problem here is that they had enough people to be noticed by the enemy, but they did not have enough people to fight the enemy if they were noticed. So Task Force Andrews waited to set off for Hostile, and Colonel Reed did what he could to help them, which in this case was firing artillery towards the border to ensure that the army could get to Hostile as soon as possible. And there was no return fire from the Germans at this time. Once the artillery had finally faded, Task Force Andrews was ordered to move out, and its forces would not be attacking altogether. It would be spread into 3 separate armies. And so Troop C was under First Lieutenant McCaleb, and he would be spearheading the operation towards Weichensalz to free the rumored 300 prisoners of war there, Allied prisoner of war. And Troop A, which was commanded by Captain Catlett, would also rendezvous at Weichensalz. And after it was secure, with Troop C, they would capture Hostile from the north and secure the stud farm as well. And Troop B would provide backup and security. And once everything was secure, one part of Troop A would also continue towards Hostile, and this was led by First Lieutenant Quinlivan. And the platoon should continue to Hostile through the forest route that Captain Stewart had taken when he went to negotiate. And this was to create 2 possible paths to the farm, hopefully securing the success of this operation. It's always better to have more than one way in. And so this did not go all off without a hitch. There's always hang-ups. And within minutes of crossing the border, the Germans opened up fire on Troops A and C. Their MiG-42s, which is what's pictured here, they fired at the Americans, determined to take them out. And for the first mile into enemy territory, the Americans were assaulted time and time again. And although we did not suffer any severe casualties, we lost a lot of ammo, and even more importantly, we lost a lot of time. And soon we came upon a town called Weir, and even though they put up some fighting, they quickly surrendered, because the American way of fighting was to blast the town until there was nothing left standing, and they did not want that to happen to them, so they surrendered to the Americans. And so Troop C passed through Weir, and they were ordered to stop. And this was because the next landmark that had been expected to appear did not show up, which means they were lost. And so Colonel Reed halted the march through Major Andrews, and this took about until 17:05, which is 5:05 p.m. That was when the prisoner of war camp was secured, and also when they learned that they were one town off of where they were supposed to be. So, they were captured, the 25 Germans that surrendered at Weissenschultz. And at this point, this was the only part of the mission that the rest of the soldiers were really aware of, was saving the POWs. They did not know about the not-so-human prisoners of war. And Dr. Lessing, who had stayed the night at Baron von Dobersch to rest, he received news the next morning from the Baron's butler that the Americans had passed outside not 10 minutes ago. And so he tacked up a stallion and rode to Hostau, heading back to the stud to inform Rudofsky about their oncoming saviors. And only slightly before he reached the stud, General Schultz had left the area, leaving Rudofsky as the commanding lead in Hostau. And as the American GIs saw the fleeing Germans, they asked their commander, Quinlivan, if they could shoot after them, and he declined. However, he did have them fire artillery over empty fields where it would not hurt the horses or the people, and he did this to ensure, or to reveal, any German tanks or artillery that was still in the area. And so while the Americans were coming up, Rudofsky ordered for all of the swastikas at the stud to be taken down, for white flags to be hung out of the upper windows as a sign of peace. And he also took down Hitler's portrait, which had been hanging above his desk for years. He had saluted it for years, and he shoved it in a filing cabinet and ripped apart that oath that he had held for so many years, figuring that the horses were the only thing that mattered at this point. And then they heard the Americans firing on them and were, for good reason, very concerned. So Quinlivan waited for several minutes after firing the artillery around Hostau, and not a single round was fired back at the Americans. And at this point, Stewart and Catlett's platoons had caught up, and so they all headed down the hill towards Hostau. Lessing and Rudofsky came out to meet them, carrying a large white sheet before them and a crude offering of parley. And as the Americans reached Hostau, reached the gates into the town, it was time for them to officially surrender to the American forces. This church is where they surrendered at. And to their surprise, the Americans were greeted with a lot of welcome and cheer as they marched into Hostau, and a lot of prisoners of war came out to greet them warmly. And in front of them at the church was a battalion of soldiers, all of their weapons on the ground in front of them, and an offering of peace. And Rudofsky, who was, as stated before, now the commanding officer at Hostau, lowered the remaining Nazi flag, and Captain Catlett replaced it with the American flag, signifying that they were now under American rule and protection. And so after Hostau was secured and all the German soldiers were put under lock and key, their weapons confiscated, Reed arrived to use his own initiative, as Patton had stated. And he inspected the stud under the tour of Rudofsky. And Stewart rode out to the 3 satellite locations to where the rest of the horses were housed. And they agreed to protect 2 of them along with Hostau, but Task-Schlowitz was ruled out because it was too close to the Red Army, and they feared that the Russia would attack them if they also invaded that area. And we have a new problem. Big surprise. And so after hostile was secured, Reed's mission that Patton had mentioned before was sent. And only Captain Stewart's Troop A, 2 Chaffee tanks, and 2 howitzer motor carriages would be spared to protect the town and the stud and the 2 remaining satellite farms. And also only left 164 people to fight against the Russians if they were to invade. So Reed had to go back to his headquarters at Bohenstrasse, and he began to make plans to evacuate the horses from Hostau to Bavaria as soon as possible. So Quinlivan, he was left in charge of security, while Rudovsky would still remain in charge of the stud at the moment. The Americans were 18 miles into enemy territory, and they had one long, thin supply line. That was it. And they also had 3 locations, as mentioned before, to protect and the most valuable animals in the world. And Stuart decided that drastic measures needed to be taken to ensure the survival of not only the horses and the stud, but also the troops. And so he decided that 100 of the most reliable German soldiers would be given their weapons back to fight alongside of the Americans. And this also spurred the Polish, British, French, and American prisoners of war, along with Cossacks, to fight alongside of them. And in the entire history of World War II, this is only one of 2 times where Germans and Americans fought together, which is pretty cool. So, at this point, there was even worse news that came through. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, the Reich, was inbound, and this division was known for killing civilians in every town they came through, killing them in cold blood. They were cruel, and they were attacking all around Hostau. And they were only 9 miles away at this point and moving closer. And so on April 30th, all hell broke loose, and the supply line was under attack from the SS. The Nazi soldiers advanced on the stud and the town as well, and so Stuart and Catlett had to assess the situation and make sure that the stud would not fall into the enemy's hands. Firepower, yay, it's what America is great at. And the SS was definitely strong in infantry, but Catlett and his multinational army had advantage in the sheer amount of firepower. They still had the howitzer motor carriages and the Chaffee tanks, which were able to launch artillery shells further than the Nazis' Panzerfaust rocket launchers. And they planned everything very carefully, and after a 5-hour-long fight, the SS was defeated. For now. They suffered hundreds of deaths and severe injuries. And so now the SS fell back. The other 2 attacks that had taken place along the supply line ended with American victories as well, although Private First Class Raymond Mans was critically injured. He was shot in the forehead as he was trying to give his troops cover. And so he would later on be awarded a posthumous award of the Distinguished Service Cross. And another major event happened on this day at 3:30. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. Unfortunately, this did not mean that the Germans would surrender. Not yet. The new Nazi government was rising under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who Hitler had appointed ruler before he committed suicide. And the Germans in Czechoslovakia and Austria were also still resisting as fiercely as they could. And as before, the stud was horribly exposed. Everyone there was essentially sitting ducks. There were more babies now, and the mares that had not given birth were extremely pregnant, and they could not travel anywhere in their own power. And this population just kept growing because refugees, along with their own ponies and horses, continued to flood into Hostau. May 2nd, the SS troops moved to attack Hostau again, and Stuart once again ordered the men to fire their M8s and their Chaffee tanks. And it wasn't long after they started firing that they heard even more guns, but these guns they recognized. And they were from the 387th American Infantry. Under the orders of Colonel Long, they had pushed through the no-fire line, which they had set up at the stud so that the horses would not be injured. They could not shoot artillery within this line. And they pushed through this line to maintain contact with the 42nd Troop at the stud, which essentially meant that Hostau was now becoming part of the American front line. And the next thing to happen was extremely surprising, and the 11th Panzer Division was going to surrender. And General Weissenberger was ordered to do whatever he could to prevent this. The Americans had been given, this was a great opportunity for them. Patton, much to his great excitement, was ordered to move further into Czechoslovakia, and at St. Martin, where Podowski was with Stallion, his news was not so great. He had been ordered to defend the town against the incoming Americans, but there was a big problem with this because he knew if they fought the Americans, they would most likely be mowed down and the horses would be hurt. And so he decided to basically do a cop-out. He set up defenses, but he did not set up tank defenses as he was commanded to do, and when the Cry leader arrived, he was not very happy with Podowski, but Podowski told him that he had not put up the tank barriers because if his army needed to move out to help the rest of the Nazi army, they would not be able to do so with the tank barriers there. And he was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And so Podowski was able to get past that. Thankfully for him and the Stallions. And so when the Americans did arrive at St. Martin, not long after that, Podowski ordered all of their riders at the stables to change from their Nazi field uniforms into civilians' clothing. They locked away all of their weapons and did not resist inside of Arco Castle, although some of the Germans outside did. The Americans took residence of the castle, and none of the riding school's riders nor horses were harmed. And so Podowski met with the major, who was also a horse lover, and Podowski easily convinced him and Lieutenant General Walker that the horses must be saved. And Walker had the idea to invite Patton to a show to get him to put the Spanish riding school under official American protection. One could say that it was a major stroke of luck. And so when Patton did arrive at St. Martin to see the riders perform, this was on May 7th, and at 4 a.m., just as he was about to fly out, Patton received news that the Germans had officially surrendered, and this was a cause for great joy for most of the Americans, but Patton was still somewhat disappointed. Weissenberg had not been successful in keeping the Panzer Division from surrendering. And Patton watched the show, and while not overly convinced at how important this art was, he figured that it wasn't right to let any type of art form this old die out. And he viewed this as much more important than dancing or singing or painting. So he put the Spanish Riding School under the official protection of the American Army in order to restore it to a newly risen Austria, which is also important because it meant that when Vienna was put back together, they would receive the horses back. The Americans would not take over the Spanish Riding School. So preparation, the horses were finally beginning to, they were starting to make plans to move the horses out of Hostau and into Bavaria. But again, they did not have the transportation for this. They couldn't move the mares without inducing labor. And so Quinlivan, he was chosen to prepare flatbed trucks to transport the mares on. And another problem that they had was the rest of the horses, the stallions and the horses that were not with foal or newly born, would have to be drove across the ground like a Mustang roundup. And there was a severe lack of horsemen among the American troops. But thankfully, the Cossack troops and German troops under Radowski, along with some of the Polish workers at the stud, they agreed to help the Americans move the horses, as they were all good riders. And there was a lot of debate, but they finally decided that the horses would be sent to Kotzking and Fort Imbild, which were both small towns in Bavaria about 40 miles from the stud. And they didn't have great facilities there. It was mostly just farmers who agreed to house the horses, but they were also much safer and farther away from the Red Army. And it was about this time that there were Czechoslovakian soldiers that had been moving in on the stud every day, scoping out the stud, and they decided that they had a rat among them, and Radowski was blamed by the Americans. And so Quinlivan, he managed to find more trucks to transport the horses, and there was an abandoned German army artillery training school, which was a few miles from Hostau, and there were almost 30 trucks there that they were able to liberate from the abandoned school and bring them back to Hostau. And they worked day and night putting sides and ramps up on the trailers so that the horses could get on there safely. But at this point, there was another new problem, and Soviet T-34s, which were the Soviet tanks, had just appeared on the horizon. And Reed marched out to confront the Russians, and after a very unveiled threat to fire their own artillery on the Russians if the Russians moved forward, the enemy shut off her tanks, but she did not leave. They were in a standstill at the moment. So finally, May 15th, the horses were loaded into trucks and sorted into 3 herds that would be following the trucks. And the herds would be policed by mounted horsemen and jeeps to make sure they behaved themselves and followed the rest of the groups. And there were also refugees now, and refugee horses and families that were tagging along with them to find safety in Bavaria, because as Reed stated, he had nothing against them. They needed safety as well. And Radowski, who had been struggling with the fact of leaving his family in this area, Reed finally agreed to let him stay at Hostau, which is a little easier because at the moment the Americans believed that he was a traitor. And so May 15th, all the horses started moving away from Hostau. And once the horses were loaded, moving, most things went smoothly. There were 13 riders who decided that trying to ride 2- and 3-year-olds would be a good idea. And I can speak from very painful experience that riding a 3-year-old is not a good idea. It never ends well. And so, within minutes of leaving the stud, they were tossed. And the 13 horses took off back to Hostau, but they decided to round them up later, leaving them there, so they wouldn't have to halt the procession. And everything went pretty smoothly until they got to the bridge at Furthenwild. And there were soldiers standing upon the customs houses, and they stated that they could not take the horses from Czechoslovakia. The Americans had no claim to them. And Quinlivan did not have time to deal with this. The horses were bunching up, starting to get antsy, and he knew that if they waited any longer, that the horses would bolt, and everything would be in vain. So he told the soldiers, the Czechoslovakian soldiers, that they had 3 seconds. And if they did not open the gates in 3 seconds, then Quinlivan would open them for them with the M8. And finally, once Quinlivan got to 2, they opened the gates, and the horses were finally in Bavaria. And the situation, still not perfect. They still didn't have enough to care for the horses, but they were also no longer in danger. And Podowski flew into Reed's headquarters, and he was very pleased at the state of his stallions and mares. And he helped Reed pinpoint the stallions that were at the Piber stud, which was the main stud used for the Spanish riding school. And these horses had a brand on them that was a crown with a capital P above it. And Reed agreed that when transportation could be arranged, the horses would be moved back to St. Martin. And at this point, St. Martin Arco Castle was completely stuffed to overflowing. Podowski had to find more room for the horses, but thankfully there was Reikersburg Airfield, which was an abandoned Luftwaffe airbase. And Brigadier General Collier said that the stallions could stay there. They could convert the area into stalls for them. But there were Poles there that had taken the area hostage and refused to let the horses come in, refused to let anyone come in, until the Americans came in, and they decided very quickly, once the military police came in, that they decided to surrender. And it was also decided that the Arabians and Thoroughbreds that had been at Hostau would go to Mansbach, which was a German stud. And so finally, the horses were loaded into trucks again to be driven the 60 miles to the airfield. And there were German prisoner of wars that were drafted to be drivers and grooms, and American jeeps escorted them. And on May 22nd, 1945, the stallions arrived at the airfield, greeted by Podowski. And finally, after years of war, the stallions were officially safe, which was Operation Cowboy. And this operation spurred a lot of creations in the decades since it took place, and the Maestoso Petra on the left is actually how I ended up learning about Lipizaners when I was about in 4th grade. And then Ghost Riders, the middle book, was the main point of research that I used for this project. And then the White Stallion of Lipizza, along with Margaret Henry's album of horses, also have scenes about the Lipizaners in them. And then here are my image citations. There are a lot of them. And then the books and the websites I used to create this project. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. And click